A blood covenant is a traditional custom in which two parties exchange blood as a symbol of a binding agreement or promise. The act of exchanging blood is believed to create a spiritual bond between the parties involved, and the covenant is considered to be sacred and unbreakable. The practice of blood covenant is often used to seal alliances, friendships, partnerships, and is considered to be a powerful way to establish trust and loyalty. In some African cultures, the blood covenant is seen as a way to create a familial bond and is sometimes used in marriage ceremonies. In today's session, we will take a trip to Africa and see how this blood covenant worked in the lives of two missionaries. I'm Dr. Ray, and welcome to this week's Hosea International Speaks. What the blood covenant in Scripture provided was an entrance into the presence of God. In the case of Adam and Eve, the shedding of the blood together with the covering of the animal allow Adam and Eve back into the presence of Yahweh. What does it mean when I say into the presence of Yahweh? It means in Adam and Eve's case, they were still able to communicate with him, but because of their sin or their fall, they could no longer talk to him face to face. What is meant by face to face is prior to their fall, they could talk to Yahweh face to him, with their face to him, without the consequences of death, because they were sinless. They were pure. They were made in the image and in the likeness of Yahweh so that he could see his reflection in them. But when they fell, Yahweh's reflection was no longer in Adam and Eve. Yahweh was reestablishing communication with man when he called Abraham out of the Ur of the Chaldees. It's a possibility that the worship of Yahweh was nearly extinct when he found a man that would believe his word. We saw in the last session that the seal of the covenant with Abraham was circumcision on the part of Abraham. Every male child at the age of 8 days was to be circumcised, and the circumcision was the entrance into the Abrahamic covenant. When the child was circumcised, he then became, notice, an inheritor of everything connected with the covenant. In the child's father and mother, or should the child's mother and father die, another Israelite under obligation to care for the child, it would be their responsibility. Or if the husband should die, to the care of the widow, other people would then help out. It is the law of the covenant. All things are laid upon the altar of the covenant. All things then are in keeping with the blood brother, which is meant that the death of or loss of a wife or the firstborn or destruction of the property, all things were then laid on the altar. Now, I heard Pastor Shane Vaughn say that America is the lost tribe of Israel. And without further research or even lessons taught on that, that statement could be very true. Why? Well, let's look at it. We all know that in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, as it is said. But did you know also that in the same year was the expulsion of the Jews? And though some converted to Catholicism in order to remain in Spain, some might have decided to travel with Columbus on his search for the New World. I say all this because under blood covenant, if a parent or if the money maker, so to say, dies It is the responsibility of relatives, as we just read prior, or those in close proximity to care for the survivors. Why is it America that America gives so liberally to the world when the world is in dire need? Why does America give especially to Israel and is ready to back them in situations too overwhelming for them? Why? Blood covenant. Now, this is all speculation sometimes, but because people from all over Europe migrated here, there were those Jews who were Sephardic amongst those immigrants. Now, back to the blood covenant. Just how important or binding is a blood covenant? Let's look at two instances. Most people have heard of the story of David Livingstone and Henry Stanley, or just plain Stanley and Livingstone. One illustration of Stanley's help might help us to grasp the significance. When Stanley was seeking Livingstone, he came in contact with a powerful equatorial tribe, or a tribe along the equator. They were very warlike. Stanley was not in the condition to fight. Finally, his interpreter asked him, "Why don't you make a strong covenant with them?" He asked what it meant, and he was told that it meant drinking each other's blood. Stanley revolted from such a rite, but conditions kept getting worse until finally the young man asked him again why he did not cut the covenant with the chieftain of the tribe. Stanley asked what the results of such a covenant would be, and the interpreter answered, "Everything the chieftain has will be yours if you need it." After several days of negotiation, they arrived at the covenant. First, there was talk or parley in which the chieftain questioned Stanley as to his motives and standing and his ability to keep the covenant. The next step was an exchange of gifts. The old chieftain wanted Stanley's new white goat. Stanley was in poor health, you have to understand, and goat's milk was all about him being able to be nourished. So it was very hard for him to depart or give this up. But the chieftain seemed to want nothing else. He finally gave up the goat, and the chieftain handed him this 7-foot copper-wound spear. Can you imagine exchanging a goat for a stick? Stanley thought he had been beaten, but he found out that wherever he went in Africa with that spear, everybody bowed to him and submitted to him. Now, another part of the covenant is the substitute part. The old chieftain then brought one of his princes. Stanley led forth one of his men from England. Then the priest came forth with a cup of wine, made an incision into the chieftain's substitute wrist, and let the blood drip into the cup. Stanley likewise made an incision into the wrist of his young Englishman and let his blood drip into the cup of wine. Then the wine was mixed, and the bloods were mixed and drunk. The priest handed the cup to the Englishman. He drank part of it and handed to the chieftain's substitute, and he drank the rest. Next, after that, they rubbed each other's wrists so that their bloods mingled. Now they had become blood brothers. Even though these two men were only substitutes, they had bound Stanley and the chieftain and Stanley's men and Stanley's the chieftain's soldiers into a brotherhood that was indissoluble. Then, after all of that, gunpowder was rubbed into the wound so that then when it healed, it would make a black mark to indicate that they were covenant men. The next step in this ceremony was the planting of trees that were known for long life. After the planting of trees, then the chieftain stepped forward and shouted, "Come, buy and sell with Stanley, for he is our blood brother." A few hours before, Stanley had to stand guard over his bales of cotton and his trinkets and everything that he brought with him. But now he could leave the bales open and leave them in the street overnight and would not be disturbed. Why? For anyone to steal from their blood brother, Stanley, was a death penalty. The old chieftain couldn't do enough for his newfound brother. Stanley couldn't understand the sacredness of this, though, and years later wondered about it. Upon finding Livingstone, Stanley found out that Livingstone also had made blood covenants in order to get where he was. Now, let's look at an important part of the ceremony which we did not go over. As soon as the two young men had drunk each other's blood, the priest stood out and pronounced the most awful curses that Stanley had ever heard. Curses that were to come upon him if he broke the covenant. Then Stanley's interpreter took his part and pronounced curses upon the old king, his wife, his children, and his tribe if they broke the covenant with Stanley. You remember when Moses apportioned the land to the different tribes, he called their attention to the mountain of cursing and the mountain of blessing. And in Deuteronomy chapters 11 and 27, you find the curses of the old covenant and the blessings of the covenant. The curses were pronounced upon or from the mount of cursing each year, and the blessings were pronounced from the mount of blessings each year. The ceremony of tree planting was always done if they were in a country where trees grow. These were called memorial trees, trees of the covenant. Though Abraham did not plant the terebinth tree at Mamre, it was a place of covenant between him and Yahweh, and there he built an altar. You can find that Genesis chapter 13, verse 18. Now, in place of where trees do not grow, they set up a pile of stones or erect a monument as a memorial to remind them and their descendants that they were in partnership or with an indissoluble covenant. Remember Jacob's dreaming about angels ascending and descending? It was there that he set up stones as a place of covenant with Yahweh. You remember Abraham gave to Elimelech some ewe lambs, and the lambs were for a memorial. As the lambs grew and the flocks grew, that flock would be a continual reminder of the covenant that had been cut. The moment a covenant is solemnized, everything in that a covenant man owns in the world is at the disposal of his blood brother. If he needs it, and yet his brother would never ask for anything unless he was absolutely driven by what to do. Now I want to draw your attention to the portion of scripture that many have overlooked, which is a part of the covenant men make with each other and which Yahweh made with Abraham. James chapter 2, verse 23 says, "And all scripture was fulfilled, which saith Abraham believed God, and it was imputed to him for righteousness." Listen to this phrase. "And he was called the friend of God." This calling of each party friends is solidified by a handshake. Even though Abraham and Yahweh couldn't physically shake hands, the fact that Abraham believed Yahweh was as though each had shaken hands. Most of this week session was taken from the Blood Covenant by E.W. Kenyon, and you can find more in his book. I'm Dr. Ray, and I'll see you next week on Hosea International Speaks.